this wouldn't really capture the nature of the medium for our users and would become unwieldy for us pretty quickly. So just to go over some of the issues with email, and these are not comprehensive in any way, there's way more than this. It's a highly distributed service involving several actors that play different roles to accomplish end-to-end mail exchange. And this is because an email message is not really an object at all, but more like a process. And this is reflected in the way it's used by and understood by donors and users. Email is threaded, so therefore not totally amenable to that same logic that I talked about of deliverable units as other born digital material tends to be. So single messages isolated from their context might make little sense, especially as email is increasingly used informally in order to send what might be considered throwaway messages. So think of pulling up a PDF-A in the manuscript's reading room that says something like, "Thanks, see you there." Without the context, without the thread, that doesn't really make much sense. Another major issue is that email is increasingly rich. So it includes attachments, images, links, and calendars. So all of these would need to be embedded somehow in order to capture the full meaning of the message. And this would probably prove to be an insurmountable challenge for our current e-manuscript delivery system. And that's why we were excited to start working with ePADD, which, for those of you who don't know, is a software package created by Stanford University for the purpose of ingesting, appraising, and providing access to email archives. So how can email help us, ePADD help us? So it's exceptionally easy to use for non-technical researchers and donors, and is able to reproduce the threaded multimedia nature of contemporary email. Its ease of use is probably its greatest asset, and to a great extent it achieves its usability by being faithful to a representation of email which we're all familiar. It reproduces email's threaded multimedia nature. It makes it possible for a universal environment which would save training time for archivists, curators, and researchers having to learn and relearn bespoke systems. So donors at the point of acquisition, as well as archivists and curators, can use the same or similar system to process and make use of these archival collections in a context which replicates the one we're familiar with from mainstream media browsers. And especially with ePADD, lexicon search and entity recognition makes making GDPR decisions, which are the biggest barrier to access by far, a lot easier. Oops, sorry. So ePADD uses entity recognition, which can recognize different email addresses that probably belong to the same person or entity, and then collapse those threads together, as well as lexicon searches, which basically use huge word banks of relevant words. So you might have a lexicon bank for financial issues, for instance, which is a highly important area in terms of future access. And it'll return results with words like bank or payment, which the curator or archivist can then mark as do not process. Both of these capabilities, combined with the ability for the archivist working on collection to label entire threads, entities, or messages as sensitive or not, makes making sure collections are GDPR compliant before giving access faster and simpler than it would be otherwise. So here's just a quick screenshot of what the ePADD user interface looks like. It's really intuitive for anybody who has any experience using anything like iTunes or Outlook. But ePADD definitely doesn't do everything, and there's still significant challenges. So ePADD's lexicons are a powerful and adaptable tool for email processing, but human expertise is still required, and this is really important. It's not as if it's possible to run a lexicon search over a particular collection and rely on it to accurately distinguish between compliant and non-compliant messages, especially with personal archives. So the built-in lexicon banks can either be too broad, providing false positives, a high rating in the drugs and crime category, for instance, for somebody who does their Asda shop weekly and buys mushrooms each week was one that cropped up a few times. Or false negatives, where highly salacious material is buried in allusion and innuendo and is only discernible to those in the know. And this is especially true of writers' archives who are particularly fond of using metaphor, innuendo, and being very gossipy. It's also worth noting, though, that lexicon searches do become a lot more powerful when they're used in tandem with the expert knowledge of the archivist. So as the archivist becomes more familiar with the collection, they can add or remove words from the lexicon banks, creating custom sets which are geared more precisely towards a particular collection. Another more abstract question is, what do we lose by emphasizing usability? So as I said, ePADD's really useful for representing email collections as we're used to seeing them. But my question which I'd like to pose to people as well, is there something to be gained from learning as archivists and researchers to meet email on its own terms and try to get a grip with more technical metadata? Would this open doors for new kinds of research which we've yet to see? Of course, we can have both, and ePADD doesn't obfuscate, but the software is so good at what it does that it might be worth asking the question of, does it prevent us from necessarily learning skills that might prove useful in the future? And my last question about the limits is, how does the discovery module work in practice for researchers? So the discovery module contains extracted message level metadata, including fine-grained entities extracted from the message. And I'll show you an example of it later because it's quite hard to visualize through words. But the metadata is presented in the ePADD discovery in custom interface, which redacts the domain part of the email addresses, parts of the subject of the message, and parts of the message itself that is not recognized as an entity. So the discovery module is really designed to give users a sense of the content, but can also sometimes be seen as obfuscating it. In some ways, this is more of an issue of clarifying and being open about what we can provide access to and why, crucially, and about how an interested user can go further through the discovery module. And that's what I'm going to talk about in my final slide. So that's an example of the lexicon, the custom lexicon, and how easy it is to add categories and save them and edit them. And this is an example of what a heavily redacted message in the discovery module might look like. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is a collaborative work in progress, and that's the shared discovery site. So it's a work in progress expansion of the discovery module, which is currently in use at Stanford University. Includes collection and message level metadata from multiple repositories. So it includes, it's going to include messages from repositories such as the
Have we lost Callum?
Callum, hello? We seem to have lost Callum.
I think he's frozen.